Welcome to Lecture 2, Part 2. And we're going to shift from the Stoics, naturally moving away from the Stoics in our description of the first part of Homework 2, up to Epicureanism. Here comes Penelope's sister Annika. Let's see if she makes an appearance. They're probably going to fight about this so treasured spot. Okay. And now Annika's going to destroy a whole bunch of shit over here, or she's going to lay down. I don't know. So, Epicureanism. Epicurus held that emotion is central to life, and his belief can be seen as, and one thing we see about the Epicureans is they generally posit a philosophy that's considered self-centered. It's about personal experience, and they don't really stress any level of social responsibility. Really the ultimate me generation way back in the day. The goal was to free oneself of irrational fears and desires, and we can think about locking into Plato's higher forms, right? Become open to pursue natural and appropriate beliefs that lead to pleasure. And that's kind of their metric, right? If it feels good, do it. If it feels good, it must be okay and it must be right. And the empty erroneous beliefs lead to pain, so we want to rid ourselves of that, thus maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain. You can see this is not a very sophisticated philosophy, and it's very much the case of the baseline of operant conditioning, if you will. Therapy consisted of encouragement of positive emotions cultivated to dominate one's experience and increase the absence of pain, right? So good food, good wine, good song, good partners, that was kind of the deal, and we lived the good life, and stuff feels good. And notice that this was a very kind of wealthy and or middle class kind of philosophy. I don't see how the slaves in these cultures were reaping the benefits of Epicureanism, right? So they were probably feeding the Epicureans. Regardless, so Epicurus, it's impossible to live a pleasant life without living wisely and honorably and justly, and it's impossible to live wisely and honorably and justly without living pleasantly, and that's about as far as it goes. So I'm probably doing them an injustice, and those of you who are well schooled on philosophy can probably find issue with what I've said, and that's cool. Annika, you made it. You got to the treasured spot. Now, let's move forward, and we're going to do a two-track model in this next little subsection. We're going to talk about Augustine, Islam, and Aquinas, right? So we're going to bracket Islam between two Christian thinkers and see what was happening at this point in time as we move away from Greek thought. Okay. Well, St. Augustine describes this as a struggle with the passions. And he's combining Plato's philosophy, and he's really well schooled in this, with Christianity. And he authored the Confessions, and this is largely an autobiographical work, describing his struggles with the passions. And this is why if you want to keep an emotion journal, or if you're in psych of adjustment, you want to keep a journal. If in providing examples for this class, right, being autobiographical is often a very good and effective way to learn, especially about emotion or motivation, because it's important to us as part of the force within us, right? Now, we see with St. Augustine a very early Christian attitude is we live in original sin and a state of sickness, right? Divine truth, though, exists as a dim light within us, and our struggle is to find that light, to seek that light, and to make that light shine brighter. So it relies on the Platonic duality of higher moral rational soul that overcomes the lower souls where the perception and appetites dwell. Right? So it's the body versus the divine soul, and then it is, in fact, really a conflict theory. And who's one of the primary conflict theorists that we're going to talk about in psychology? Modern psychology. And if you're saying Sigmund Freud, you'd be right. It's all about conflict. Right, Annika? So, sensation, common to animals and man, we share that. But contemplation of internal things, like Platonic forms, is unique to humans. Immutable truths, right, of God were to be contemplated to enable man to live virtuously, taming one's emotions, right? So whether these arose, automatically and involuntarily, Remember, the Stoics are saying that there's kind of an affective experience that can be translated into emotion. With Augustine, maybe it's a little less clear, but often we maybe see just the arousal of emotion without a lot of free will in suppressing it. And that comes after the fact through training. So our experience is divided into passions that we're going to have to learn to tame and control for the good, right? And affections are largely virtuous when guided by goodwill and reason. So again, it's just the conflict between the passions and the intellect, if you will, in the service of, for St. Augustine, God and becoming a more holy being, right? So St. Augustine in the Will considers Seneca's first movements as involuntary. All right. The judgment placed on the first movements, according to Augustine, leads to the nature of affection, good versus bad. And this is where we begin to judge these affects and think about how they occur within life. Augustine believes that will can affect the passions, the first movement, by shaping what we attend to. And note, now we're manipulating our relationship to our environment, right? What we choose, the environment that we place ourselves in, can lead to, predictably, certain emotional experiences. So if you believe that bodily arousal, as Augustine might, is something to be overcome, right? And you don't want to immerse yourself in sexual imagery, right, and give in to that necessarily, then you probably want to stay the hell out of strip clubs. If you go into a strip club and you're trying to avoid sexual arousal in that context, then that's the wrong place to go. You don't go into the strip club, right? If you're intemperance, you have a problem with drinking, then it's probably best to avoid bars. So Augustine is very clear and very straightforward here that environments supply certain stimuli, and if those stimuli lead to certain emotional experiences, the best thing to do then is probably teach yourself to avoid those environments. Right? And it's a very simple case and really kind of very well supported by empirical evidence. Can we stop that, please? Excuse me for a second. We have cats being assholes. My God, you should have seen Electron's tail was about this puffy because he's just being a jerk, right? So, and now Annika's on the prowl. I don't know if we're going to get through this one. But notice that we're talking about then to the modern notion of unconscious having tremendous impact on our attentional process, subsequent choice, pursuit, ranking of stimuli, and this really resembles Aristotle's notion of habit. But this is the way that we can kind of program ourselves, is to avoid trigger situations or stimuli that seem to be our downfall. And this is why I often have assignments where we look at stimuli and how they trigger thoughts and or affective responses. Yeah. We're going to move here into Islam, so we're going to go into the Middle East, right, at this point in time, and this is a time when a lot of the rest of the Western world is kind of at war, is fighting amongst itself, is burning libraries, etc., to destroy people's philosophies for essentially no good reason. And what do we see happening here in the golden age of Islam? Islamic folk are traveling the world, and they're trying to protect, retain, learn from, understand, store, and reconfigure all the work that's been done in the world up to that point, right? So they want to protect this and translate all this scientific, medical, and philosophical works. And of course, their language of choice is Arabic, so everything is being written into Arabic. And they're not only were these works translated, though, but they explored and reinterpreted and expanded upon. And I kind of think that I would have, and I know some of you might have really enjoyed participating in this era, because what they're doing is exposing themselves to all this thought, they're reflecting upon it, and synthesizing out of that new thought. And it must have been a tremendously exciting area. So Ibn Sina, right, reinterpreted the four humors, remember Hippocrates, as well as the associated temperaments. And he comes to believe that emotions arise from the powers of the sensitive soul. So emotions might be relatively automatic and relatively involuntary in his conceptualization. They were preceded by cognition, bodily affect, and behavioral changes. So all these components combined, the soul is processing this information and then generating an emotional response. This is probably not a system that's well supported with our current understanding, right? But this thought was thought to inform Aquinas', who's coming next, view significantly. So, I devoted myself to the study of the texts, the original and the commentaries, in the natural sciences and metaphysics, and the gates of knowledge began to open for me. Next, I sought to know medicine, and so I read books written on it. I cared for the sick, and there opened to me some of the doors of medical treatment that are indescribable and can be learned only from practice. And that came from Ibn Sina. So, as we move towards the next part of homework 2 that someone might select, we're moving that way, we're going to discuss the role of poetry. The imaginative is the speech to which the soul yields, accepting and rejecting matters without pondering, reasoning, or choice. So there's like this automatic pipeline into the soul through the arts. Excuse me for just a minute. Annika. All right, so there we go. Electron took his turn chasing Lucy, and now Annika's got to participate as well. She's on the prowl again. Annika is one of the most stubborn cats you'll ever want to meet. You're about to hear a screech or a howl, I guarantee it, right? A profound understanding of the path to persuasion that relied not on reason but on feelings. And notice what the advertising market has learned and how they exploit this. That have a strong influence on moral action, right? Poetry can work involuntarily on the reader. First movements in training, is that what's going on? Tapping into habit? Is this the development of habit, the existence of habit? And notice how it revolves around that idea. Now, the Rich Petty Lab, where they study persuasion, right, and that study of persuasion certainly feeds to the advertising industry. One of my good buddies, Dr. Mazzocco, Phil Mazzocco, who I went to graduate school with, worked extensively with transportational imagery. And what they would do is manipulate kind of the emotion-evoking imagery within persuasive messages to transport people into these states. And I think that, Ibn Sina is talking about this even back then. Now, Ibn Rushd diverges a bit. Virtuous activity could be based on free choice rather than habit, so that's an interesting extension of the idea. Poetry can bridge internal experience and the external world of objective stimuli. And I think, he's describing this with poetry, and I think many of us will attribute this ability to many of the arts and not just poetry. Universal themes that portrayed universal experience are often the fodder of the poet, right? Thus, portrayal of virtuous acts elicits a level of pleasure that will compel people to virtuous behavior. So we read about courage, we read about virtue, we read about moderation, and we see the positive results, and then we want to emulate it. Albert Bandura would be totally on board with this, right, with social learning theory. Note how this might be the precursor to Jung's concept of collective unconscious, which is one of the more difficult concepts to deal with out of Jung, right? That we have this, we're tied into this collective unconscious that's communicated essentially through art, and that's why Jung was so impressed by and immersed himself in artistic pursuits, right? So, Ibn Rushd, not universally admired, though, and we know with Islam that Islam at this point in time was beginning to fragment into different groups, and these different groups then had different perspectives and were often in pretty strong disagreement, even to this day, right? So he advocated both revelation through reading the Quran and with interpretation as guided by reason. And we'll see that this is very similar to who's up next, right? The Sunni school was not to embrace this stance at the time, and so we see Islam kind of bifurcating, and then even more so becoming divisive. Thomas Aquinas subsequently explored the relationship between faith, really as described in religion, and philosophy. Okay? You're back. You done torturing people? This leads us to homework 2. And in homework 2, right, Ibn and Ibn Rushd, poetry and affect tied to universal themes, right? This is for the poets and those that appreciate poetry among us. So out of your group of 6, whoever resonates to poetry, you might want to jump on this one, right? If there's a couple of you that strongly resonate to poetry, then you'll have to do some virtual arm wrestling, however you're going to settle your agreements on who does what. Select an emotion-evoking poem and cut and paste it into your portion of the assignment, right? So I still remember a poem from 11th grade English in Mr. McMillan's class, and it was an amazing class. And it was a horrible poem, I mean, as far as its imagery, and very saddening. And it was called The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner. And it was a poem about a guy who was on a B-17, right, and was shot, you know, as they're on a bombing mission over Germany in World War II. It's a very sad poem. And it really brings home the experience that people must have had in World War II in the big bombers like the B-17s and the B-24s, etc. But notice that's what it was designed to do, to evoke. And ultimately, I believe the author of the poem was anti-war, and you know, is trying to communicate the costs of war, but it's from an emotional point of view, and that's what makes it so compelling, right? So how does it use then the poem you select for this portion of the assignment? How does it use emotion to persuade or teach, right? And that's usually what that's about, is to develop some kind of message or lesson, right? So, and what is the lesson? So what elements does it use? What is the lesson? And how might it become internalized? And that, let's go back to this idea of becoming habitual. So what is necessarily habitual in the first place